After Stalingrad, the Soviets began a long, grinding advance westward. They liberated Soviet territory, then pushed into Eastern Europe, and the Germans fought every step of the way, but they were slowly being pushed back. In July 1943, Germany launched one more major offensive on the Eastern Front at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. But the Soviets had learned of the attack through intelligence and were prepared, and the German offensive was defeated with massive losses. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing to invade Europe. Churchill wanted to attack through Italy, the soft underbelly as he called it, while the Americans wanted to invade France directly. They compromised and did both. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, conquered it in about a month, and this led to Mussolini being overthrown by his own government. He was arrested and Italy began negotiating surrender. Hitler saw this coming and had already sent German troops into Italy. So when Italy officially surrendered in September 1943 and switched sides to join the Allies, German forces quickly occupied most of Italy and rescued Mussolini, setting him up as a puppet ruler in northern Italy. The Allies invaded mainland Italy, but the Germans put up fierce resistance. The mountainous terrain favored defense, and the Italian campaign became a slow, bloody slog northward that wouldn't end until May 1945. By 1943, the tide had clearly turned against the Axis. Germany was being pushed back in the east and was losing in the Mediterranean. Japan was on the defensive in the Pacific, and the Allies were bombing German and Japanese cities heavily. In Germany, Albert Speer was put in charge of war production and managed to increase output, despite the bombing, partly by using millions of slave laborers from conquered territories and concentration camps, but it wasn't enough to offset German losses. The Allies were also winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Improved tactics, technology, and intelligence meant U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could replace them, and Allied shipping losses were decreasing. In late 1943, the Big Three Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in Tehran to coordinate strategy. They agreed that the Western Allies would invade France in 1944, while the Soviet Union continued its offensive in the east, squeezing Germany between two fronts. The planning for the invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord, was incredibly complex. The Allies had to assemble millions of troops, thousands of ships and aircraft, and countless tons of supplies in Britain. They had to decide where to invade and how to deceive the Germans about their intentions, and they had to wait for the right weather conditions. The German defenses along the French coast, called the Atlantic Wall, were formidable. Concrete bunkers, beach obstacles, mines, artillery, and Rommel, who had been put in charge of defending France, was working hard to strengthen them. But the Germans didn't know exactly where the invasion would come. Most German commanders thought it would be at Calais, which was the closest point to England. But the Allies had planned an elaborate deception operation called Operation Fortitude that reinforced this belief while they actually planned to land in Normandy. On June 6, 1944, D-Day arrived. It was originally scheduled for June 5th, but bad weather forced a delay. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied commander, had to make the tough decision to go on the 6th, despite weather that was still not ideal. That night, thousands of paratroopers were dropped behind German lines to secure key positions. Many were scattered by wind and lost, but they created chaos behind enemy lines. At dawn, over 150,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches in Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. The landings at Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword went relatively well, but Omaha Beach was a bloodbath. The Germans were positioned on cliffs overlooking the beach and had excellent fields of fire. Landing craft were destroyed, tanks sank, soldiers were cut down as they left their boats, but through incredible bravery and determination, the Americans managed to get off the beach and secure a foothold. By the end of D-Day, all 5 beaches were secured, and the Allies had a foothold in France, though casualties were heavy with about 10,000 Allied casualties, including around 4,000 dead. The Germans were slow to respond because Hitler thought the Normandy landings were a diversion, and the real invasion would come at Calais. He refused to release panzer divisions to counterattack, and by the time he realized Normandy was the real invasion, it was too late. The Allies built up their forces in Normandy, broke out of the beachhead, and began racing across France. Paris was liberated in August 1944 to scenes of incredible joy, and by September, Allied forces had reached the German border. Hitler launched one last desperate offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, where German forces attacked through the Ardennes again, trying to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. They initially made good progress and created a bulge in the Allied lines, but the Allies held key positions like Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded but refused to surrender when the Germans sent a surrender ultimatum. The American commander, General McAuliffe, famously replied, "Nuts," and the Americans held until Patton's Third Army relieved them. The German offensive was defeated, and it exhausted Germany's last reserves. In the east, the Soviets launched a massive offensive in January 1945 that drove through Poland toward Germany. They were motivated partly by revenge for what the Germans had done to the Soviet Union, and the treatment of German civilians by advancing Soviet troops was often brutal. By April 1945, Soviet forces were in Berlin fighting street by street toward the center of the city, where Hitler was holed up in his Führer bunker. Hitler knew the end was near. He married his longtime companion Eva Braun, wrote his will blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat, and on April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops were literally blocks away, Hitler and Eva committed suicide. Their bodies were burned, and the remains were later found by the Soviets. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed unconditional surrender documents, the war in Europe was over, and May 8th is celebrated as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. But the war wasn't completely over because Japan was still fighting. By 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. They had lost most of their conquered territory, their navy was virtually destroyed, American submarines had strangled their shipping and economy, and American bombers were conducting devastating firebombing raids on Japanese cities that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed entire cities.